Please, everyone, take a seat so we can start in time. And I also invite you to move to the front if you would like. Thank you, everyone, for joining our event today. I am Selma Elgamal, Project Manager at World Future Council, and I will be your moderator for today. Our theme of the event is Pathways Towards a Renewable Energy Future and Exploring Multiple Opportunities. Very briefly to the structure of the event, we will start by a keynote speech, and then we will continue to a panel discussion by experts on renewable energy. And then we will like to invite the audience for their interventions, their experiences, or questions they would like to raise, and to have an interactive discussion. So renewable is key to not exceed the global warming of 1.5 degrees and to achieve net zero emission. However, for a successful energy transition and a long-lasting energy transition, there's more to consider than just moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The energy transition must be sustainable, inclusive of everyone, just for everyone, and resilient for the future. In addition, all regions of this world vary in geographic, social, political, economic, and ecological circumstances and needs. Thus, we have to follow multiple approaches tailored to the needs of each region and the individual requirements of each region and community, to meet their needs and enable a just, resilient, and sustainable energy transition. This will further require a cross-sector approach and work with civil society organizations, governments, the public sector, the private sector, just to name a few. So in this regard, I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of experts to talk about renewable energy opportunities in regions such as Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But before we get to the panel, I'm also very delighted to introduce to you Mr. Dinesh Kumar Gimire, Secretary of the Ministry of Energy, Water, Resources, and Irrigation of Nepal, for his keynote speech. You have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to give a keynote speech in the theme, the pathways for renewable energy. All of us are aware that the renewable energy's contribution is very, very significant towards moving into the clean energy transition for which the whole world is dreaming. The majority of the fossil fuel source of energy need to be replaced by the clean energy source to attain our committed NDC targets and our international commitments. So every nation, every states are striving towards replacing those dirty sources of energy by the clean sources of energy like hydropower, renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and so on. So in my keynote speech, I'll be highlighting a little bit upon what Nepal stands in this and what are the pathways, what are the ways ahead for Nepal to go into the clean energy transitions by also utilizing the renewable energy sources, solar and wind. And of course, hydropower is also a source of renewable energy, which is around almost 98%. It contributes 98% of the energy sources of different sources in Nepal. So, having said this background, I'll be little bit speaking upon what approach we are following to develop and use the renewable energy in Nepal. Nepal is a hydro-dominant country. We have almost 98% of hydropower sources with us. But majority of them are run-of-the-river type of hydropower projects, whose generation actually depends upon the flow, existing flow in the river. So, there is a big supply and demand mismatch across the different seasons, the wet seasons and the dry seasons. So, to cater this supply and demand mismatch, in the wet season we have surplus generation, but little bit of lower load, and in the dry season we have less flow in the river, less generation, but we have higher demand, peak demands. So we want to address this mismatch by utilizing the solar power, whose potential is, very significant in Nepal. Around 2100 megawatt of economically feasible solar potential is existing in our country. So we want to utilize this solar energy as a complementary source to hydropower generation, hydropower source. Like when the flow in the river is low, we can't generate more power in the daytime because we have to store water in the pondage. So in the daytime, we have abundantly available solar potential. We want to generate solar power. So we use in the daytime, and we store water in the peaking pond to generate the full capacity hydropower in the peak hour. So this is the complementarity modality of using this solar potential in our country. We want to develop this grid solar projects in this modality. However, we are also focusing on the off-grid solar and wind power in our country. Given the country's terrain, difficult terrains, higher Himalayas and mountains, where the national grid is inaccessible, but we have plans to electrify the whole country within 2 years down the line. So we want to install solar and wind off-grid into those remote and rural areas. Till now, we have already installed something like 0.9 million solar power plants all across the country. Solar home system they are called. They contribute to the capacity of around 45 megawatt altogether. We have done the wind mapping also, but the geology is not very much favorable to go for the wind power plants. There are some installed in hilly regions, but due to the transportation of wind blades is not supported by the hilly terrains of Nepal. We have plans to go massively for solar rather than wind. Another dimension that we want to switch on to by using solar or renewable energy is the cooking. Domestic cooking contributes a huge load in our country. So, we want to use the clean cooking in our country to move into the clean energy transition and also to fulfill the NDC and SDG targets that we have already committed. By now, we have already installed more than 440,000 of domestic biogas used for cooking as well as in some cases the domestic lighting also. And something like 11,000 clean cooking stoves, 1100,000 clean cooking stoves we have already accomplished all across the country. Another area we have benefited from exploiting this significant amount of renewable energy is this has contributed to carbon emission reduction significantly. So we have plans to reduce this carbon emissions by something like 8.6 million metric ton by 2030, and that is 35 million metric tons of CO2 emission we want to achieve by 2045, by when we aspire to be a net zero emission country. That's our commitment. Another area we are focusing on RE is to electrify the rural electrification. The country is planning to electrify 100% population of the country by the coming 2 years. So, in the remote and hilly areas, this solar and wind powers are being developed to electrify these areas. Where other areas where grid is accessible, our grid connected power plants or extension of grid electrification is being used. So we are doing our last mile electrification plan to complete the 100% electrification in the country by coming 2 years. So RE in terms of solar and wind also helps in this regard. So it's a decentralized form of electrification in the country that we are following to leave no one's behind for availing this electrification facility, very much in line with the SDG goals and commitments. So, and we are very much committed to provide the public supports for clean energy transition. We want to be a party for that. And then also the Powering Post-Coal Alliance. That is one of the, agreements that we would like to enter in and very much eager to support in that front. The advantage we are getting from development of more and more renewable energy. By saying renewable energy, I want to emphasize that our 98% of hydropower is also a renewable source of energy, and we are operating some 8 carbon projects in our country, and we have already earned around 28 million dollar out of selling this CR reduction to different neighboring countries. So that's also where our scope lies, and we're also focusing on that. So don't want to take much time. I've presented the status of REs in our country, and then I'll be happy to come back if I get any follow-up questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimire. And I'm now pleased to welcome our panel to the stage. Dr. Ewah Eleri, Executive Director of International Center for Energy, Environment and Development. Please join us. Dr. Jahangir Masum, Executive Director of the Coastal Development Partnership in Bangladesh. Very welcome to have you with us. And also Mr. Raju Chhetri, Executive Director of Prakriti Resource Center in Nepal. Thank you very much. Presentation. I would now like to move on right away with our panel discussion. I would like to invite Mr. Ewah for your interventions on renewable energy and opportunities in Nigeria.
Thank you, Salma. Are we going to have the presentation on?
There should have the presentation on. Can you please put the presentation on? Nanda. Not anymore, fellows. Okay. Now it's
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to present a collaborative work that we in the International Center for Energy, Environment and Development are doing together with colleagues from the University of de Montfort in the UK, Surrey University, Sussex University, and 4 centers in Africa, Nigeria, and Senegal, in West Africa, and Kenya, and Tanzania, where we are looking at the sustainability, inclusiveness, and governance of mini grids in Africa. And so, next please. And the presentations are the following. We'll provide an overview of the research projects that we're doing in these countries and provide early insights from the literature and the field work that we've conducted, and some of the reflections on the way forward for mini grids. But let me pause here to say that in the past 10 years or so, there's an large, significant momentum for mini grids worldwide, promoted especially by development, the international development financial institutions and a number of governments, looking at mini grids as one of an important tool in providing and expanding energy access, and of course mini grids that is sustainable in terms of the use of carbon neutral energy. And this research project is actually looking at these 4 countries. First and foremost, looking at the literature and looking at the evidence on the ground in these 4 countries to see how sustainable this model of access expansion is. So we will look at the evidence for mini grids performance in these 4 countries in Africa, develop a framework to analyze the political economy of energy access, and conduct country case studies, and then also use the opportunities for capacity building. So what have we done so far? We've completed literature review and produced 4 papers that are in the final stages of publication. We've conducted field work in the 4 countries and developed a database for that. And then we're in the process of analyzing the data and producing preliminary results. Next, please. So what do we find in the literature for mini-grids? Well, we find in the literature that there are, especially on the technical side of mini-grids, about 3 stages. One is the design stage, the operating stage, and then the long-term issues concerned with the technical sustainability of mini-grids. And that essentially what we find is that the success and failures of mini-grids often start with the design of those mini-grids themselves. The technological choice, the plant size, equipment quality, and so on and so forth. And of course, when mini-grids begin to run, how prepared the users are to use them, acceptance of the technology, user satisfaction, and so on. How does the operator behave? What kind of training that is available, and so on and so forth. But most of all, issues that are more long-term, what does mini-grids do when the central grids come into those localities, and so on and so forth. Next, please. So these are just some highlights of those kind of considerations that are in the literature. But, again, some of the main issues are really down to economics, the economic issues of mini-grids, And that for the 4 countries that we are currently doing our research on, that the evidence is very poor, very scarce in between on financial sustainability of mini-grids. Mini-grids that can run by its own strength, where there's strong demand and purchasing power by those local communities to be able to afford them, and where, as in most cases, subsidies are some of the issues that are always on the table in terms of that, because affordability is really very low in most of the countries. So that's a bit of superficial summary of some of what the literature, the economic literature says. On the governance side, in all 4 countries, there are tensions between, of course, state and markets, which I know you can find in most countries that, expanding access to electricity. How much are we leaving this to market forces alone, and how much do you need stronger regulations? You need the government to step in to be able to expand electricity. So issues of regulation, issues of of institutions, issues of incumbency between those institutions that were there that were providing electricity before and the new ones that are providing mini-grids. So in most of the countries, the ability of users to pay is a big challenge. In some countries, in Senegal and Tanzania, for instance, you have strong incumbents. You have Senelec in Senegal and Tanesco in Tanzania, both of which are really active in this field. But the common denominator is that all 4 countries, that much of the financing and the driving forces for mini-grids are really external. International development finance, development partners. In my own country, the $300 million that we got from the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And just the ability to have domestic sources of finance is challenged, and how much of this comes from national budgets to ensure that that these are sustainable when donor funds run out. Let's quickly just look at some of the more highlights in the specific countries. You know, Nigeria has very good, it's been celebrated as having some very good regulatory frameworks and that capacity building for entrepreneurs who are in the mini grids are pretty strong. But then, of course, those issues of sustainability when donor funds run out, and the issues of inclusivity in terms of who really benefits from this. You know, how does the benefit spread between men and women, for instance? You know, and then the focus on productive use. Who are really the owners of those demand loads? You know, and how much are local communities involved in the design and participation and so on and so forth. So both issues, you know, of inclusivity in terms of gender dimensions to it, but also how the participation of local communities in the design are quite apparent in Nigeria. Kenya is slightly a bit different. In the Kenyan model, you have companies, especially international companies, that are operating on commercial basis. You know, locating demand loads that are productive, that can pay for itself, you know. And the results, yes, of course, it's too early to conclude, but the results look slightly better than we have in the 3 other countries. You know, in Tanzania, you know, where the national incumbent distribution, the national utility company is handling this. Again, issues of inclusiveness is also quite clear in that way. We talked a little bit about Senegal. Senegal had a little over 300 mini grids plants, you know, that were supported by international donors. Since that money dried away, no new plants are being built. Issues of operation and maintenance are there. You know, how to run these plants in the absence of a solid delivery model and continued financing. So, you know, just to summarize, what are our preliminary tentative conclusions from this area? You know, sustainable mini grids in these 4 countries is really very hard to find. You know, mini grids that you can say that can stand by themselves long-term with long-term, you know, sustainability. The technical, economic, and social governance dimensions might not be working in harmony, you know, and significant pieces of the jigsaw for mini grids are still missing. So we're thinking that a whole system approach is still not visible in most of the countries, but there is need for continued conversation on the tension between state and market in the delivery of energy assets using mini grids, and in all, more research may be required on the role of mini grids in global assets expansion. But Selma, let me stop here, and then we can come back to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for presenting the project that you're working on and for pointing out the necessity of affordability of mini grids, especially in Africa, and also the issues of inclusivity in the region. And as well, I find it very interesting, the similarities and differences that we find in the region, despite the various circumstances. I would now like to move on to Masum and to hear about a locally led project in Bangladesh. Masum, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salma. Today I will basically talk about locally led just energy transition towards 100% RE. If there is no COVID, maybe I would show you some picture of implementation, because we are already like 2 years behind the schedule due to the COVID. But the journey started in 2018. And we did a research jointly by University of Technology Sydney. Sven was the principal researcher. Then World Future Council was also involved, Bedford the World, Germany, and Coastal Development Partnership, our organization. So in that study, we have shown that by 2050, it is possible to run Bangladesh 100% by renewable energy, even if there is no option to use hydrogen. You can cover 80% of the energy needs of the country just by wind and solar. So the study was basically revolutionary in that context. Before the study, there was no understanding about the potentiality of offshore wind in Bangladesh context. So, but as a people-centered organization, our perspective is just transition is fine, it's a good concept. But if the whole world is run by renewable energy, mitigation is reduced, does it really, will help poor people? Does it ensure their access to energy? So this is the big question we are facing. And that's why we call like this just energy transition. It should start from the bottom. So that has to be like community lab, bottom-up, partnership-based renewable electrification model. And that model has to be kind of a business model. Otherwise, it will not sustain. So what we did after the study, we thought that we want to build a 100% renewable energy run village, a model village, so that others can be interested, or how 100% renewable energy can contribute in the rural electrification as well. Why this idea came? Because if we consider in rural context, you will see even many countries will boost. Oh, we have covered 100% renewable energy, electricity access. But the reality is, in rural area, it still lagged behind. Even in Bangladesh context, like household without access to electricity is 5 times more prevalent in rural areas than the urban areas. And also, we want to change the government definition of 100% coverage. Because if in our country, if single household is electrified in a village, we consider that is electrified village. But the reality is different. Even in an electrified village, not all the poor have access to electricity. That is the reality. So this model village gives us a hope that everybody will have access to electricity, clean cooking facility run by the renewable energy. And we are interested because still in our country, around 6,000 villages, they are out of electricity access. And among them, more than 1,000 villages in off-grid areas. They might never be in the electricity access if we don't have this kind of mechanisms. So we try to do that thing. And also there is another challenge. Why 100% renewable energy model? Because all the mini grids, I mean, my friend is talking, that is hybrid model, not 100% renewable energy, because there 10 to 20% diesel provision is there. And it is basically due to the economic reason, to be cost effective, to reduce the battery cost. So in our model village, we also decided that this electrification system should be compatible like a very developed country, like Germany. So that if a poor people, like in a country in Bangladesh, they should not have kind of a low-grade infrastructure, energy infrastructure, because that is not energy justice. So this model, when we are talking, we found why the community is not interested. Unfortunately, solar home system also is a reason, because it's very much costly in terms of the poor people's context, and also repairing and other things is very much challenging for them. So they really want something, they don't have to bother. No, they will just use the services. And they said that, okay, if you take care of that things, then we can solve the whole process. So we told them that don't worry, the technical part will be designed by the technical experts, business plan will be developed by the business experts. You will just have to concentrate, support the project, and after 10 years, you will be the 50% owner of the project, the infrastructure. So this is also a way of transferring ownership to the community. And the ownership, basically, we divided that it will be bottom-up approach. So in Bangladesh, our target is one union. And one union basically comprises 9 villages. So now every village will have 5% of share, and the local government will have 5% share. So this 50%. And the business entity who will manage these things, they will have 50% share. So after 10 years, these 50% share, the community and the local government will get, if they really support the project, so that to sustain the project. And as far as we decided that currently we managed to assimilate $500,000 so that we can go for a kind of a system that can support 1,500 people. A whole village, we have decided that has this kind of population or 300 households. And we already have, like some experts have basic design and stages, so I will not go in detail that. And the ownership, basically, what I would highlight, will go to the women head of the household. So the community ownership, this is another way to bring women in the energy sector, because this is an area in our country, women are virtually absent in the decision making and others. So through this approach, we want to bring the women there. And also it's a long-term project, like the life cycle is 25 years. We consider that women basically take care of things for a longer time. And within the 6 years, we will train the women groups so that they can take care of the operation and system maintenance gradually. And by that time, they will also have an energy cooperative that will provide electric cooking facility run by this renewable energy. And the renewable energy system that we will install there, it is not only based, it's multiple sources. Like it will be based on solar, based on wind, and solar could be also floating solar because we have a lot of water resources around. So based on the geography, it will be decided by the experts. And if we cannot cover the whole thing by multiple sources of renewable energy, then we will put battery just to avoid or make it 100% renewable energy. So why we are basically what we want to achieve? Of course, this is could be seems like a good NDC target fulfillment approach, but no. The community considers access to energy is a key to their adaptation, key to prevent their loss and damage. And that context is missing in the energy narrative. Everybody is considering techno-economic mitigation perspectives of energy use. So, because if they have access to electricity, they can diversify their livelihood. They can diversify their skills. They can prolong their productive time. They can get information in real time. So there is many opportunities that they can really explore. That is not possible now. And also, this will help to show the world that women-led just energy transition is possible and very much feasible. And through this process, we basically want to highlight people's energy sovereignty concept. Because nowadays, every country knows after the Ukraine war, energy security concept is challenged. Everybody is looking for energy sovereignty nowadays. So it's a high time. And if you want energy sovereignty, you have to involve your own people. And that has to be from the grassroots level. So we also want to highlight that one. And our government, if they can follow this model, they can ensure SDG 7 targets. They can also ensure their NDC target as well. So it will be a win-win for both people and the government as well. And for the civil society, we basically will highlight through this model the energy justice narrative, to dump the techno-economic narrative of the energy context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masum. Thank you for highlighting the importance of community involvement and especially the gender aspect of the deployment and acceleration of renewable energy and to achieve a sustainable energy transition. I would now like to move on to the aspect from Nepal on renewable energy and the importance of renewable energy. Raju, you're invited to have the floor.
Thank you very much, Salma, and namaste to everyone. Well, in the beginning, in the keynote speech, you have already heard our secretary talk about the context of Nepal, where we are heading, what's the plan of the government in order to move to 100% renewable energy. So we do have a very ambitious plan that we do want to address energy poverty, but at the same time also become self-reliant and self-sufficient in the energy that we produce and we use. Well, let me just, given the context that we have been working around promoting 100% renewable energy in the context of implementing nationally determined contribution. So if you look at the plans from Nepal's NDC document that has been submitted to the UNFCCC, in a way, it's a quite ambitious plan given the country context of Nepal. As a mountainous country, as a landlocked country, and a country that has a lot of its other basic needs to be really fulfilled. So having this ambitious plan is, in NDC itself is quite promising, in fact. But of course, what we also said is, in order for us to really implement these plans, resources will be required, and that will be required in a big terms. If without that sufficient resources, we'll not be able to implement those plans. So in order to promote this really work, what we did initially was establishing something called MAP platform, multi-actors platform for 100% renewable energy, where we have about 46 different diverse inclusive stakeholders coming together to talk about how we can really achieve this. Of course, this is in the context that we also take into account climate change and renewable energy. Because before having this discourse, a platform being established, what we primarily focused was climate change community talking in silos, of course, the renewable energy community talking in silo. And one of the very main objective of this platform was to bring these two communities together so we can see it from the climate change angle, but also look into where the feasibility of really having this 100% renewable energy in the country context is possible or not. So in fact, this multi-actors where we have government representatives, civil society, private sector, we have community representatives, media, academia, all these sectors coming and discussing about 100% renewable energy in one platform was itself a new thing. And that did lead us to a couple of things. One, capacity building of our stakeholders, all the MAP members, including beyond the MAP members. Other one is really promoting and discussing about what are the right policy structure that we require, what are the procedures in order to build that. We did have a very good opportunity of working with not just the national government, but also the provincial governments and actors there, and linking it to the local level governments. So linking this national, subnational, and local government was very, very key for us. But of course, when we say that, we also keep in mind that we will have to implement Paris Agreement. And Nepal has, although a less developed countries are really committed, saying that we will want the global temperature maintained to 1.5 degrees by the end of this century. But having said that, in its NDCs, what is also really committed is that it wants to be energy sufficient. We have a plan to produce almost about 15,000 megawatts of hydropower electricity by 2030. Also have a sale of electric vehicles should be around 90% by 2030, 25% by 2020. So this kind of like ambitious really targets does give us quite a hope in terms of moving to a low carbon development pathways for Nepal. And we have said by 2025, 45, we want to be net zero emission. So I think that's an ambitious plan. But at the same time, the country is like almost 45% of the coverage is going to be forested. So that's again a tall ask for a country like ours, where a lot of our communities depend on firewood and forest products for their livelihoods, for the energy, addressing energy poverty and other forms of course, poverty in general, of course. I think given that, as our colleague very rightly from Bangladesh mentioned about how do we transition this from with this high ambition from a, let's say, highly fossil fuel-based, let's say, or let's say the biomass-based energy to a clean energy. Because currently what Nepal has really been doing is we almost import 100% of our fossil fuel from India. We send a lot of our national income, or let's say the resources buying fossil fuel and utilizing that in the form of different, from industry to transportation sectors. There is a huge need for this to change, the transition from a fossil fuel-based system, or let's say uses of fossil fuels to a clean energy. But in that particular context, what we cannot forget is how do you do this in a just manner? Of course, at the global level here, when you talk about implementing Paris Agreement, we talk about global justice and fairness, developed countries versus developing countries. Maybe there are also, but at the same time, what we also think is important that we also talk about equity and fairness at the national context. How do you do this? How do you reach this energy system, or let's say energy poverty really addressed at the national system? That is very key. But of course, we also know that government alone won't be able to fulfill this. The working in collaboration and cooperation with private sectors, CSOs, communities is very key. And that is something that can really be a key element in terms of moving how justice can be achieved. We may have views, national plans, but if the communities or the people on the ground are still suffering from energy poverty or poverty in general, then we may not say that we have really achieved that just transition. How do you do this? If there are people based using fossil fuels, how much time do we really need to transition from one fossil fuel based uses, or let's say energy system, to a more renewable energy system? Buying that time or giving that time to a country like Nepal would be absolutely necessary. Without that, achieving our what we call the addressing poverty, addressing the sustainable development goals, at the same time fulfilling the commitment that we have will be extremely difficult. So we don't look this in a very siloed perspective, but when you see that resources availability, of course we have the huge potentiality of the hydropower and clean energy, but harnessing that is very key, so that for the resources, financial resources will be a requirement. Similarly, the capacity, how do you build this capacity and get the right technology so that the country can really move towards building the clean and green energy future? And also working with all the stakeholders, and it means that capacity building and inclusivity is a very key aspect. So looking from this part in holistic aspect, this is what the MAP platform or the MAP work has been really promoting in the country. There are a lot of details around it. Over the past, of course, 1 year was gone with the COVID, but of course in the last 1.5 years or 2 years, we have used huge amount of experiences that we are of course happy to share in detail later. We also have some MAP members, of course, expert in e-cooking here sitting in our audience. They will also be able to share some of their experience later if you wish to get into detail. But I would be happy to take any questions that you might have later. But for now, I will stop here and back to you, Salma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raju. I think this is a great example of how important partnerships are across sectors and across multiple actors to achieve not only renewable energy transition, but as you said, also a just transition in all fields and aspects of life. And I'm happy to say that our panel is finally complete. And I'm also very happy to welcome Sven Teske to the panel. He's a research director at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. And he will talk about the technical aspects of 100% renewable energy scenarios and the approach towards it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and sorry for being a bit late. I had another presentation where basically I presented pathways towards the renewable energy future for industries and investors. So we basically have two different research streams in our One Earth climate model, we call that a One Earth climate model, which is basically an energy mitigation assessment tool. And so we have two strands. One is the industry side, and one is the support for NDCs. And we were involved both in the Bangladesh and in the Nepal work. And while I don't want to present the result, I want to actually go a bit more into detail how, because we see us from the Institute for Sustainable Futures and at the University of Technology in Sydney as a service provider for basically providing modeling and energy research service for exactly the process you just described. So there are two different ways of putting together an energy scenario. I mean, at the end of the day, an energy scenario could be done at a desk with asking no one in the country, and we can do an energy scenario. The problem then is that nobody would actually use it. So it would be a mathematical exercise, which is interesting, but not very useful. So what we do with our work is we provide the modeling expertise, and we also provide the mapping expertise. We have a team of mapping specialists in our team where we make an assessment of the solar and wind potential in a country, in a specific country under space-constrained condition, which means we look at a utility scale solar and wind, not rooftop, but utility scale solar and wind power plants, and where could they actually be installed. So we basically look at the map of a country. We have a resolution of 100 by 100 meters, and then we subtract, for example, all the human settlement. We subtract most of the agricultural land. We subtract nature conservation areas and so on. And what's left is then a potential space for utility scale solar or wind, or we could actually both. And that's one aspect. And on top of that, we look at the slope. So is, for example, that country, is there a slope more than 30%? And that was, for example, obviously in the case of Nepal, quite often the case. So we subtract that as well, which means we are not using sort of mountainsides as solar mounting systems, and you can't install wind there either. And so the next step is, where are the roads, and is it possible to actually access those areas? And the last step is there a grid? In many countries we have a lot of we have good conditions for solar and wind. In my home country, Australia, we have a lot of solar and wind potential, but most of it is pretty far away from the grid. So there is a theoretical potential, but not a practical, not in the next few years at least. So that's what we do. Secondly, we then provide those maps to our partners on the ground, say, okay, this is what we find out, what do you think? And then there is usually a debate, obviously, if this area is actually suitable or not, because we don't know it. We always need to have a sort of a person who actually knows the area on the ground and say, well, actually this is good, we could do that, or this is certainly not the case because of whatever reason. So that is the first assessment. So we have in the first step the potential for solar and wind already. We also assess to some extent biomass and hydropower if data is available. Biomass for us is really only a fallback option. We try to not use biomass in our energy scenarios because it's quite often double used. So, for example, if there's a potential of, I don't know, 10 exajoule of biomass, then let's say the plastic industry and the packing industry and the energy industry, and they all use those 10 exajoule, but all of it. So basically it's double use. So we want to make sure that we have sustainable biomass potential, which is quite small in most countries. Besides the fact that biomass is a very basically a very inefficient way of, in terms of land use, to actually convert it into energy. A solar panel has about 15 to 20% conversion rate per square meter of sunlight, and biomass is just 1 or 2. So the energy demand, the energy harvesting per square meter of bioenergy is very low. So you only use it in some conditions. Secondly, we access public databases or databases where we buy the data for a specific country. We usually use International Energy Agency data, and then we present that, put it together, and then give it to our partner on the ground and say, well, is that actually true? Is that real? What's wrong? What's missing? So that's another step. A third step then is we discuss with the partners what kind of technology is currently in the debate in the country. In the case of Nepal, it was really interesting about hydropower, because very few countries actually have additional hydropower potential, but Nepal has an enormous one. So we basically have to decide with our client, with our partner, how much you think is acceptable. Another example, for example, when I was in Bangladesh, and I have to say I'm a dual citizen, I'm German and Australian. When I've been to Bangladesh, it was a real experience, because I've never seen a country like that. So we realized that space is an issue. So we actually had to think differently, really, in terms of how to develop the concept. And last but not least, we also do a system analysis, which means we we put together a plan how, for example, households in the future could look like in terms of the appliances. We generate a synthetic load profile for the households, for all the households and the industry, and then simulate in 1 hour steps our solar and wind plan and other renewables, 100% renewables plan, and we wanted to know to what extent we actually have to expand the grid, how much storage do we actually need, and how can we, what is actually required in order to make the whole system work, or is it microgrids? Are microgrids a better solution? Again, in Nepal, there are quite a few villages which are quite remote, and it doesn't really make sense to connect them to the grid, to the national grid. It simply doesn't make sense. So a microgrid is a good solution, and it's not, and I would like to stress that, a microgrid or mini grid or whatever you want to call that, sort of isolated grid, is not just something for developing countries. Australia, the whole northwestern part of Australia has only microgrids. There is no national grid, because so 500 kilometers north of Perth in Western Australia, the grid ends, and the next 2,500 kilometers to Darwin, there's nothing. There's no grid. All those communities actually have a microgrid, and that makes perfect sense. And there are communities with heavy industry. So it is not just a solution for a little bit, for a solar panel here and there. It could be actually provide real power. So basically that's what we do. We provide the technical assistance. We provide the technical expertise and modeling expertise. But we are basically open to suggestions. So we basically say, what do you want? And then try to model that, and I hope you had the impression that we actually did this, because it doesn't make sense that we just give something, model something for a country and say, well, that's it, and there is no pickup and no acceptance, and therefore the work is useless. So I think to speak with people on the ground, to speak with the stakeholders, have workshop. It's a vital plan, because then we have buy-in, local buy-in and acceptance, which means implementation is more likely as a top-down plan.
Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you. Thank you for providing us with like an insight on the process of the development of technical scenarios. I think it's an essential part to identify the renewable energy potential in each country and to move forward towards the implementation of renewable energy and the energy transition. I would now like to move to our panel discussion, to open the discussion and to invite you to provide us with your insights, with your experience from your country, from your organization, or if you have any questions, also please feel free to raise them. So I would give the floor to the audience for any kind of intervention that you would like, and please just present yourself briefly and feel free to continue with your intervention.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I'm Stefan Schurig, Global Renewables Congress and Foundation's 20 platform. One question to the panel, and not sure who wants to respond to it, is if you will be able, or if you would decide about what the most rate limiting factor for renewable energy actually is in your particular constituencies. What is the most important thing, or what is holding back investments into renewable energy? What would it be? And one other question to Sven maybe is, does it make sense, you mentioned the difference between mini grids and national grid, and in some regions, no matter whether it's a developing country or an industrialized country, it does not make sense to extend the national grid to the most remote areas. But however, there are certain areas where it's just about to be connected to the grid. So I always thought it makes probably sense to distinguish not only between off-grid and on-grid, but also near-grid, because near-grid is about to be added to the national grid, and off-grid is a complete different strategy and a complete different finance scheme behind it. So 2 questions. Thank you.
We have one question here. I will just gather maybe 2 or 3 questions and then we will start responding.
Thank you so much. My name is Koila Bonaheng. I'm with PowerShift Africa. We're based in Kenya, and I'm from the Kingdom of Lesotho. And as you're describing these countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, I resonate so much with my own around the terrain, very impossible to, very mountainous, very impossible to access, the role of women as well as energy leaders in these communities. So what I'd basically like to sort of ask all the panelists is, with any technological disruption, there's always already existing systems on the ground. So I'd really like to know, with this technological disruption, the transformation required to help these communities uptake the renewable energy. I'd like to know, what is the role of indigenous knowledge in getting that work done? We're talking about communities that have been depending on biomass for the longest time. You think about decades. How do you get them to buy into renewable energy when biomass is all they've known? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw in the very back. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much. My name is Yona Turinayo from WWF Uganda, country office. I have just like 2 questions, but which are almost related. My question goes to Dr. It is Ewah. Yes. Thanks for the presentation, first of all. This regards to the mini grids, the affordability, and also the sustainability aspect which you mentioned. I want to know what kind of recommendations possibly you can give to these countries who have already integrated the mini grids within the renewable energy transition program. And again, the mini grids you are talking about, do you mean solar mainly, or they are mini grids considering all renewable potential renewable resources? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I will take one last question in the very back, and then we can start answering.
Thank you. My name is Kiel Kühne with Leave It in the Ground initiative, Lingo. A lot of the discussion often circles around what could be done or should be done. And at Lingo, we have asked ourselves what's already being done. And because we come from the climate angle, we think that renewables are an important part of the solution, but actually for the climate crisis, the important question is how quickly do we shut down fossil fuels? So we will be launching this week a new framework called fossil-free zones. And I would like to ask the panelists if you know of any inspiring examples that you would like to share of places that are already free from fossil fuels completely.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to the panel to answer the questions. Sven, would you like to start?
Yes, I start with the technical ones. The near grid question first. I'm actually involved in a project we work at our University Technology of Sydney with the Aboriginal Land Council from Australia. And the Aboriginal Land Council identifies their area, and they can actually apply to actually assess their land, and then it would be under the sort of governance of the Aboriginal Land Council. So what we do is we do mapping for solar and wind, mainly in the outback of Australia. And we have quite often the case that those communities are near the grid. So there are two different ways. One, our experience is that there is some sort of a connection that people want to be connected to the grid because they feel included in the country. We actually have in Australia quite a few examples where we have an 800-kilometer line and there's literally nothing in between, and then there's a community, and that actually really doesn't make sense to have that line maintained. But it's sort of a psychological thing that they actually want to keep the line. So the answer is, if there is good potential, I would say an upgrade of the grid would be wise in order to export renewable electricity to the cities in order to get revenue to actually earn money with it. So that would be an option. A second option, we have done that for Bihar. I was involved in a Bihar project about 10, 15 years ago in India, where we developed a technical possibility to have mini-grids, which are then step by step connected with each other. And basically, it's sort of a bottom-up electrification scheme where you expand the grid, the national grid bottom-up. That's another possibility. So I think there is no yes or no, it depends on, but if it's very close and if there's a good potential, it makes a lot of sense to actually connect the communities and then provide the ability to actually export electricity.
Well, very briefly, on the first question that you're asking, what is holding the investment? Well, I think this is pretty clear that as long as we continue to subsidize fossil fuel investment and the fossil fuel companies are really gaining or making money out of fossil fuel, it's going to be tough. I think there needs to be a very fundamental switch that moving fossil fuel subsidy but investing on renewables, the research for technology, promotion, and also expanding of this technology. Unless that is really not done, then we might do it one day because the current context will force us to go down that line, but the process might be slow. So if we want to really quicken that process, that is very key. And I think this also relates to the person who asked about if there's a fossil fuel free. Well, in Nepal, we could give you an example of the communities where they're really isolated, they may not be using so much. But of course, it's not the case. But the fundamental fact is that there is a realization that we need to stop using fossil fuel and more be reliant. Given the Nepal's country context, as I said, it's a landlocked country. We import 100% of our fossil fuel from outside. There's a realization at the political level, at the implementation level, that we have to quickly switch this from fossil fuel to domestically produce electricity. Not just that, there's also a vision that we might help our neighboring countries, like Bangladesh, for instance, providing them the renewable energy that we generate, and there's already moved into that direction. Finally, on the indigenous part, I have to say that, well, I don't know what are the really indigenous technologies in terms of the communities use, but what I can say is the knowledge that the indigenous people or the communities have in terms of managing the resources is a very fundamental part. And of course, like a lot of our cases in, the cases in our context would be they're relying on biomass for energy, right? But how do you switch that? But in a way that it can be managed with the indigenous knowledge about passing on how they manage their communities. For instance, it's been talked about using mini-grids. If there was a mini-grid just for a specific location where the indigenous people are there, then what are their way of managing resources if a mini-grid was to be established in that particular context? I think learning from them, involving them, and making them as a part of the process in terms of finding solutions, that is where the key really holds to. That's what I can at least say from my experience. Thank you.
Okay, I'm basically giving answer to most of the questions from our own experience. So first one, because we have asked these communities, what is basically holding them? Now, why they are not going for renewable? And we found basically the key policy narrative is like renewable energy is kind of an ad hoc system, not a mainstream system. So that even business or private sector is even not interested, because they don't see the long-term possibility of return of their investments. But at the cultural context, we found that community considers the renewable energy, quality of renewable electricity is not as good as like the grid electricity, because they use solar home systems. And solar home system has limited capacity. It cannot run all the appliances that the grid can do, electricity can do. So these two narratives basically holding people. And when we tell them that consider this electricity for any kind of your power use, like the grid, then they said, if that is the case, we can go for it. So people don't basically think from which source their energy is coming, electricity is coming. They want the energy use for their all needs, all households' needs. So in that context, if you can provide that needs support by the renewable energy, it will gradually reduce the fossil fuel. And I can tell you, because in Bangladesh we have been advocating since 2018. And government has gradually shifted their positions. They're all focusing on the renewable electricity. So because in our context, we have shown that even the way they're thinking international trade to ensure energy security after the Ukraine war, that context is also hammered. So everybody has to develop their own system. And also it is good for just transition if you target areas that is not yet developed for the energy infrastructure. So you can put new energy infrastructure. Because for a transition from fossil fuel to things, and naturally a country like Bangladesh, it will take at least 30 years. So within that 30 years, you can go for the areas where you can have the renewable energy infrastructure. That kind of infrastructure, it is the rural area is the most suitable. Regarding the indigenous knowledge, we have found, because especially when we talked with the off-grid community, like the islands, and there is a risk, because whatever the infrastructure, like solar panels and others, it could be damaged by the cyclone. It could be damaged by the very high tide. So community, they basically knows that which area is safer and which elevation you can use, because sometimes from outside you can have a terrain, digital terrain mapping and many scientific things, but that might not accurately work. Rather, the community will tell you, okay, use this land, make it this amount of height, so that they can protect the assets. And that's why we are calling, if you transfer the ownership to the community, if they consider that is their asset, then they will really protect that. And also, I think there is a misconception that maybe the community cannot handle the operation and system management. But if you train them, then they can do, like the clean cooking technology, electrical cooking. Many women, even in the urban areas, were not really accustomed to do that. But within a few months, they are doing it very nice. And we have trained some of the women in the rural areas. When they can do this kind of technical use, they feel confident. And we are also confident, like within a couple of years, they could be a really trained workforce. In country like Bangladesh, there is like 50% women is still not in the workforce. If we can really make them in the workforce in the renewable energy sector, this is the renewable industrial development. So that could also transform this fourth industrial revolution as well. I think if you consider the fourth industrial revolution, then you have to also consider this just energy transition simultaneously. Thank you.
There was one specific question about the research that we're doing in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal about this technology and the sources of energy that the mini-grids have. We are maintaining a technology-neutral, source-neutral research just to have an overview of what is on the ground. But the fact remains that most of those mini-grids in these 4 countries are all renewable energy mini-grids, most of them, mostly using solar. So that is the way it is. But I want to return to a common theme here about the barriers, the challenges to expanding investments and growth in renewable energy assets, because I think it affects all of us, especially for developing countries. My view is that a lot of the focus on renewables focused on technical issues. They also focused on economic issues and financial viabilities of the scheme. And one thing that I think is generally lacking in the conversation on the growth of renewable is the political dimension. Energy access is politics. You know, it's not only about the market. You know, it's not about the choice of technologies. In fact, it's also not about carbon neutral or lower carbon kind of energy. It's a political matter. Let's take a step back, all of us. I can almost say for certain, all of us around here in this room, when you move to a new house or move to a new flat, what do you get? You go to a house where electricity is already connected to. So nobody is going to ask you to pay the cost of connecting electricity to you, for most of us. So we pay electricity bills per month or per use. That is normal all over the world. I spent half of my life living in Norway, where practically everybody has electricity. So you move into a flat, there is electricity connected, there's a meter there, and what do you pay? You pay per use. What we are doing today that makes energy aspect so impossible to achieve is because for the poor, we abandon that delivery model. For the poor, we tell the poor, you have to pay the cost of connecting you to electricity in addition to paying the cost of using it. We make energy access impossible because we do not make the same demand on the rich or people who live in urban areas. In rural areas, we tell people it's like, I will build a road to your town. But you have to pay, before you use this road, you have to pay upfront the cost of building the road. Not putting a toll on the road. Not saying you pay this as some kind of tax or use, but you pay upfront the whole cost, offloaded upfront to the poor. And that is why energy access is almost impossible. In most African countries, including mine, in Nigeria, we, year after year, energy assets per proportion or electricity assets per proportion of the population is declining. At some point, we had 60% of all our households connected to electricity. Today, 20 years later, we have about 40%, 39, 30, 40% connected. So more and more people are climbing down the energy ladder. It's a political matter. And we need to raise those issues. As long as we keep making decentralized energy, mini-grids, renewable issues about state and market and technologies and so on, we don't focus on those real issues. That if you think energy is essential for delivering development, that you can live a modern life and that we can preserve the planet, we need to provide the infrastructure for delivering electricity that is clean. And once we do that, we can now demand on all, not only the poor, to pay the cost for the use. I stop here.
Thank you very much. I think this was a great pointing out of the injustice that we have currently in the energy transition and the access to energy and affordability. I see that we have one more question in the audience, please.
Thank you. Thank you especially also for the point on the politics. It segues quite well actually into what I was thinking of as you were all speaking and presenting, talking about finance. It often rolled back to finance as well. It's not a sustainable model often. I have a background in philanthropic funding, capital that comes from philanthropists willing to experience a first loss. And it occurs to me that potentially some development impact bond funding could be useful here to get things off the ground. Probably something you've all thought about before, but also wondering what you think about philanthropic capital coming in as the first loss capital for some of these projects until they're able to sustainably finance themselves. We've heard this week about a couple of big commitments from some big foundations in the renewable energy space. Just wondering if you could give a reaction maybe to that within your own context.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, then I would move directly to the panel to answering.
Well, I mean, very briefly on that. Well, what we have learned from the work that we have done back home in the multi-actors platform is that, well, this is just by government doing or any international support doing is not sufficient. We need to have multiple actors supporting if we want to really address energy poverty in a country like Nepal. Well, I mean, things are so, geographically it's very difficult, less resources in the country to really invest into that. And when the philanthropic organizations really expand that the support base, what's going to happen is rather than very concentrating on in the cities or let's say the capitals or urban areas, what we have seen in general is they even go out to isolated rural areas where the support has been very key. In that particular front, we see that expanding their base not just in the context of humanitarian aid or doing some environmental work or some development work, very targeted, specific one in renewable energy, and expanding that would be very much of a complementary work what the INGs do or what the government does, what the private sector does. I think you do have a very key role and to play there, especially looking at how we can address the energy poverty in the context of very isolated rural areas. Thank you.
Would anyone for the panel would like that?
Basically, this model, what we are talking, it's basically you need private sector or the financial system there. And current challenge is that the financial options, especially in my country, is not feasible for the private sector to go into the investment because of very short-term loan return and high interest rate. So if government really wants to focus on expansion of that renewable energy, then what my friend said, that's costing, no, that has to be borne by even the governments, maybe also reduce the taxes and provide a longer time, because renewable energy projects is 25 years life cycle. So why not investment should be also like 25 years No, the loans you will get, you should also repayment should be longer time. And that repayment is basically a key obstacle for the private sector. At the same time, I would also say the way in the developed country, the energy cooperatives are growing, that model has not tried in the developing country context. Because to sustain this system for 25 years, you have to follow business approach. From wherever the money comes, it's not important. You have to follow a professional and business approach to continue that. At the same time, you have to have capacity building option within them. So that means you need a multi-partnership approach. Government, community as a user, or even a or maintenance operator, then also private sector as a financier, and even civil society as a capacity builder. So this option really could make a new way, a multi-stakeholder partnership for just energy transition could be possible.
Thank you very much, Masum. Before we close this meeting, I would like to ask Mr. Dinesh if you would like to add a few words on your perspective on this discussion.
Thank you very much. Most of the questions are already answered. What I want to add there is to make all these renewable energy investments very effective. We have to have find some innovative mechanisms for incentivizing those marginal communities who are far away from the main grid and want to use that renewable energy, but are very marginalized and cannot even pay the basic charges of energies. So for that, we have to find some innovative ways of incentivizing them. I don't want to focus into subsidy very much in this regard, because that doesn't establish the ownership for those people. But we have to find some innovative market incentive models to to facilitate them using this energy. For example, if we give a very soft loans for capital cost for making those projects in those areas, and let those users pay in a long-term basis, as my friend from Bangladesh mentioned. So that would create the ownership as well as make them use this kind of energy. So those kind of switching on to the market incentives from the existing subsidy mechanism will be a key idea to effectively expanding this renewable energies to the marginal communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the audience for a very fruitful discussion. We close our meeting now. We move on to the next meeting. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye.